This week's parsha, Parshas Behar, begins with the mitzvahs of Shemitah and Yovel. And even though Shemitah and Yovel have many halachas in common, there are some very noteworthy differences. When it comes to Shemitah, the prohibition of working the land is both a mitzvah saseh and a mitzvah lo saseh. The mitzvah saseh is the Shabbos ha'aretz Shabbos l'Hashem. The land shall rest a Shabbos for Hashem. That's a mitzvah saseh, that the land should rest. Then we have lo saseh as well. Sarach lo sizra, karmach lo sizmar. You can't plant your field, you can't prune your vineyard, and so on and so forth. So when it comes to Shemitah, we have a mitzvah saseh and a mitzvah lo saseh. The Minchas Chinuch says in mitzvah Kuf Yud Beis that these two are fundamentally different. The mitzvah lo saseh only forbids Jews to perform avodas karka. Only a Jew violates the lo saseh. These lo sasehs weren't given to Bnei Nayach, so only a Jew violates these prohibitions. But the mitzvah saseh of the Shabbos ha'aretz Shabbos l'Hashem says the Minchas Chinuch is a mitzvah on the land. The land should rest. And therefore, says the Minchas Chinuch, a Jew is obligated to see to it that the land is not worked even by a Gentile. In other words, if a Jew would allow a Gentile to farm the land, the Jew would violate the mitzvah saseh of the Shabbos ha'aretz Shabbos l'Hashem because his land didn't rest. That's the chiddush of the Minchas Chinuch. When it comes to Yovel, the sheet of the Rambam is that there is no mitzvah saseh when it comes to working the land in Yovel. When it comes to Yovel, we only have the lo saseh. We have the lo saseh of lo sizro, lo siksro svicheha, lo siksro nisireha. We have several lo sasehs, but there's no mitzvah saseh. And therefore the Minchas Chinuch wishes to say in mitzvah shin lamed hey that this halacha, that the land has to rest, and even a Gentile, if he works the land, is a violation of the mitzvah. The owner of the land will be mevatel the mitzvah saseh of resting. That only applies in Shemitah, not in Yovel. Because in Yovel there is no such mitzvah. So it comes out that there's a very fundamental difference in Shemitah and Yovel. On Shemitah, in addition to the fact that the Jew cannot work the land must rest. There's an obligation that the land should rest. That we don't have in Yovel. In Yovel, there's a prohibition. The Jew can't work the land, but there's no halacha that the land has to rest. So that's noteworthy. Why should there be a difference between Shemitah and Yovel regarding this point? Another interesting observation the Meshech Chochmah makes. The Gemara says in Maseches Pesachim that there's a basic difference between Shabbos and Yom Tov. On Shabbos, for example, in Kiddush and Shmoneh Esrei, the conclusion of the bracha is Mekadesh HaShabbos. Hashem sanctifies the Shabbos. And the Gemara says that's true, because Shabbos is Kviya V'Kaima. Shabbos is fixed. Shabbos does not depend on the sanctification of Rosh Chodesh, which is done by the Beis Din. Shabbos is every seventh day, starting from the very creation of the world. It's Kviya V'Kaima, it's fixed. And therefore Hashem is Mekadesh HaShabbos. Hashem is the one who sanctifies the Shabbos. When it comes to Yom Tov is very much dependent on the Jewish people. It is the Beis Din of the Jewish people which fixes the Rosh Chadashim, and accordingly the dates of the Yom Tovim. And that's why we don't say that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Mekadesh Hazmanim. We say that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Mekadesh Yisrael V'Hazmanim, which the Gemara takes to mean HaKadosh Baruch Hu sanctifies the Jewish people, who in turn sanctify the Zmanim, sanctify the holidays. So there's a fundamental difference in Shabbos and Yom Tov. So the Meshech Chochmah points out that the same chiluk exists in Shemitah and Yovel. Shemitah is Kviya V'Kaima. Shemitah is fixed. We don't need a Beis Din to declare Shemitah as Shemitah. Shemitah is every seventh year, counting from when Klal Yisrael conquered the land, divided the land. But Yovel is very much dependent on the actions of human beings. The Torah says there's a mitzvah of Sfiras Yovel. Beis Din has to count to 49 years, And then it is obligated to sanctify the 50th. There's a halach of Kiddush Bezdin, just like there's a halach of Kiddush HaChodesh. That Bezdin sanctifies the new month, Bezdin has to sanctify the Yovel. So, Shemitah is like Shabbos, and Yovel is like Yom Tov. Shemitah is sanctified by the Ribono Shel Olam, but Yovel is sanctified by the Jewish people. That's also a difference that calls for a explanation. It's clear that Shemitah, following the pattern of 6 and 1, you work for 6 years and you rest for 1 year, which is exactly the same pattern as the weekly Shabbos. It's clear that Shemitah, in some sense, is a Zeichel L'Maaseh Bereishis. It also commemorates the creation of the world, where HaKadosh Baruch Hu worked for 6 and rested for 1. The question is, what does Shemitah add to the once-a-week Shabbos we already have? Because we have a Zeichel L'Maaseh Bereishis every week. Every Shabbos we have a Shabbos, which reminds us of the fact that the HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th. And we do this week after week after week, month after month after month, year after year after year, without interruption. The question is, what does Shemitah add? That every 7 years we'll have another Zeichel, another remembrance. L'chaira, it should be superfluous. If we have once a week Shabbos, what does Shemitah add that I wouldn't have known from the weekly Shabbos? What is Shemitah coming to add to the commemoration of Maaseh Bereishis? I'd like to point out, if you go back to Parshas Bereishis, we find a very interesting thing. There in the account of the 6th day, we have the first reference to Shabbos, and it says the following. It says, Vayevarech Elokim es Yom HaShvi vayikadesh oso. Hashem blessed the 7th day, and He sanctified it. So what does this mean? That He blessed the 7th day and He sanctified it. So Rashi says something very, very odd. Rashi says that the meaning of Vayevarech vayikadesh is Berachol b'mon and Kidshay b'mon. That HaKadosh Baruch Hu sanctified the Shabbos with the mon, and He blessed Shabbos with the mon. So what was the blessing? The blessing is that Erev Shabbos, L'chavod Shabbos, in honor of Shabbos, a double portion fell. So that's the blessing. He blessed the Shabbos in that He provided a double portion on Friday. That's a little strange. That's not really a blessing of Shabbos. That's a blessing of Friday. But it's called the blessing of Shabbos because it's in honor of the Shabbos. And what does it mean? He sanctified the Shabbos? That the mon did not fall. That's the Kedusha of Shabbos, that the mon did not fall. So Rashi adds to the Medrash, V'hamikra kasav al shem ha'asid. And the Pasuk, speaking of the blessing and the sanctity, is referring to an event that is far into the future with the mon. The Ramban asks in Rashi that that's difficult to understand. Why should the Torah speak about this fact of Shabbos, the sanctification, and the blessing, with regards to the mon? Why should we refer to that at the very outset of Bria Sa'olam? The Maharal asks another kasha. Maharal asks, that how can you call this a blessing? That if the mon would have fallen 7 days a week, there would have been a certain amount of mon that would have fallen over the course of a week. So now that the mon doesn't fall on Shabbos, but falls double on Friday, there's no more mon than would have fallen otherwise. It's just that what would have fallen on Shabbos instead fell on Friday. So what's the bracha? How can you call that a bracha? Maharal says still the fact that twice as much fell in one day, even though it's true that that's the portion that would have fallen the next day, that's still called a bracha. Again, a little bit of a daichak. The Malbim there in Parshas Bereishis says an amazing pshat in the Medrash, not like Rashi. He says the pshat in Medrash is as follows. to understand the Malbim, we have to make a Haggadah too. You know, we live in a physical world where we see animals, plants, mountains, all sorts of things. The Ramchal tells us in the Sefer Derech Hashem that everything we see in the physical world is really the end of a chain of spiritual forces. There is a spiritual kayach which underlies this blade of grass, and a higher spiritual kayach, and a higher spiritual kayach. And there's a chain of spiritual forces that ascends. And when HaKadosh Baruch Hu acts upon the world, he acts upon the highest spiritual forces, and the effect trickles down until it reaches the end of the chain, which is the physical object, the material object in this world. Says the Malbim that the fact that the moon did not fall on Shabbos and fell double on Friday is not something which was only relevant for the 40 years the Jews traveled in the Midbar. This is a reality in the realm of the spiritual forces which underlie the world that we know it. And he gives a muscle. He says there once was an army, and the army was an army of mercenaries who had to be paid every day. Otherwise they wouldn't fight, they would quit. So the paymaster would pay the salaries every day. But once a week, he had to go to the capital, the headquarters, to pick up the money for the payroll. So that day he was going to be away. So the mercenaries would leave. So in order to avoid that, he would pay double the day before. He would pay for 2 days. And the next day, the day he'd be at the capital, he wouldn't pay at all, because that would be the day he was getting the week's payroll from the treasury. And then he would come back the next day and give 1 day at a time. It says the Malbim that the world, or better, the spiritual forces which are behind the world, receive blessing once a week from the Ribono Shel Olam. The Ribono Shel Olam bestows blessing upon those spiritual forces once a week, and those spiritual forces in turn transmit the blessing over the course of the following days. But 1 day a week, they can't transmit blessing because they're receiving blessing from the Ribono Shel Olam. That's Shabbos. So on Shabbos, the spiritual forces receive from above, they don't transmit to below. So how are things going to thrive on Shabbos if they're not receiving from above? The day before, on Friday, the spiritual forces bestow a double portion of bounty on the world that will tide it over for 2 days to cover Shabbos, where the spiritual forces are receiving from above. So the pattern is that on Shabbos, the spiritual forces are not mashpia onto the world because they're receiving from above. And then over the next days, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, the spiritual forces bestow a single portion of bounty. On Friday, in anticipation of the fact that the spiritual forces are not going to be mashpia on Shabbos, they give a double portion. On Shabbos, they don't give and they receive from above. And this is a pattern which is not a one-time thing. This is for the entire duration of the universe. That the spiritual forces on Shabbos receive from above, and therefore they are not mashpia below, and the hashpah is transmitted over the next days with a double portion on Friday, and then the cycle begins again on Shabbos. The Malbim says this is pshat in the Zohar. The Zohar HaKadosh asks a question on this pasuk. It says that Hashem blessed Yom HaShvi. So Rashi learns it means He blessed it in that He provides a double portion the day before. Says the Zohar, how can you call it a blessing? If there's no mon on Shabbos, in what sense is Shabbos blessed? That's the question the Zohar asks. And doesn't give the answer like Rashi gives that the blessing is the day before. And the Zohar says the answer is because from Shabbos, the following 6 days are blessed. That's the meaning of Hashem blessing Shabbos. It's the Mokar HaBracha, it's the source of blessing for the next 6 days. So explains the Malbim, it's true that there's no mon on Shabbos. There's no spiritual shefa on Shabbos. But the point is, that's because that is the day that the spiritual forces are receiving from above. It's the source of blessing for the entire week. That's like Vayi. That's the blessing. The blessing is not on Friday. The blessing is on Shabbos. Hashem is mashpia onto the spiritual forces, the sustenance and bounty which they will transmit over the next days. That is the Vayi. And as a consequence, it has to be that day they don't give over because they're receiving from above, and therefore that's the Vayi Kadesh, that there is no shefa. The mon, says the Malbim, was the visible remez to this idea. Because the mon was lechem and hashemayim, it came from heaven, so therefore it was a reflection of what's going on in the higher realm, and therefore even on this world you were able to recognize what was going on above. But when the Medrash says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu blessed Shabbos with the mon and he sanctified Shabbos with the mon, it's not the mon, that's not the issue. The issue is that the mon indicates, it demonstrates a reality which is true all the time, that Shabbos is the Mokar HaBracha, Shabbos is the source of blessing, and therefore on Shabbos there is no blessing. Mashal Lamad Averdayma. That, let's say, for example, you have a teacher, a Rebbe, he gives shiur, and once a year he takes off the shiur so he can go away to learn. Maybe he goes to a Darchei or some program where he's going to learn. So the Talmidim might say, no, we're losing out. There's supposed to be a shiur, there's no shiur, we're not getting, we're not receiving. The answer is that those days that the Rebbe takes off and he goes and he charges his own batteries, that's the Mokar HaBracha, that's the source of blessing for the whole coming year. So it's true that on that day there's no hashpah, the Rebbe isn't giving over. But that's the day where the Rebbe is receiving all that he needs to be able to give over. That's why it's Vayi. That's the bracha, it's the source of blessing. It comes out that really there are two dinim, if you will, in Shabbos. Now, Shabbos commemorates two different things. It commemorates a historical fact that 5,773 years ago, HaKadosh Baruch Hu worked for 6 days and he rested on the seventh. That's one aspect of Shabbos. But there's another aspect of Shabbos, which is that from that point onward, for all time, Shabbos is the Mokar HaBracha. Shabbos is the day where the spiritual forces rest in transmitting bounty because they are receiving the bounty for the entire upcoming week from above. And that's a totally different concept. That's not a concept so much about the Ribono Shel Olam as about the Bria, about the world. But that the world rests one day a week. Why does the world rest one day a week? It rests one day a week so it can receive from above. If the world did not have to receive from above, if HaKadosh Baruch Hu would have invested the world with enough energy and bounty to last for 6,000 years from the very outset, the world wouldn't need to rest. But because HaKadosh Baruch Hu bestows the shefa, he bestows the bounty in 1 week doses, so therefore 1 day a week, the world has to rest from its being mashpia in order to receive. That's what Shabbos is. Shabbos is the Mokar HaBracha. It's the day that the spiritual forces rest in transmitting bounty in order to receive from above. In a sense, you could say that HaKadosh Baruch Hu keeps the spiritual forces on a short leash. He doesn't give them 2 weeks, or a month, or years, or 10,000 years of energy. He gives them a week's worth. Every week he gives them enough shefa, enough bounty to bestow upon the Bria for 1 week. And every Shabbos they have to come back and refill themselves, replenish themselves. So on that day that they receive from above, they don't transmit to below. That's the other aspect of Shabbos. Shabbos is the day that the Bria rests, that the world rests. It rests from the activity of giving, because that is when the Bria is receiving from the Ribono Shel Olam. It teaches us something very precious, which is to know that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not distant and removed from the world. Because HaKadosh Baruch Hu is actively engaged, actively involved. he never gives the world more than 1 week's sustenance. And that means that on a weekly basis he is engaged and involved in the Bria as a whole. But it's really a statement about the world. The world rests on Shabbos. The world rests from the activity of being mashpia so that it can receive the shefa of bracha from above. So that's the difference between Shabbos, the weekly Shabbos, and Shemitah. The weekly Shabbos commemorates the fact that the Rebbeinu Shalom made the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th. And that's important for us to know. It's important for us to know that God created the world. The world was created. It didn't come into existence by itself. It isn't eternal. It wasn't always there. So to commemorate that, once a week we have a Shabbos. So in the same way that the HaKadosh Baruch Hu worked for 6 days and rested on the 7th, we work for 6 days and we rest on the 7th. But there's another aspect of Shabbos. To understand that it's not just that HaKadosh Baruch Hu 5,772 years ago created a world. It's the idea that HaKadosh Baruch Hu keeps the world on that short leash. That HaKadosh Baruch Hu is actively engaged. He only gives the world 1 week of sustenance at a time. And Shabbos is the day that the world has to rest because the world is receiving from above. So there's a second aspect of Shabbos that the world rests. That's what Shemitah is meramis to. The Shabbos Ha'aretz, the fact that the land has to rest, is a remes to this idea that once a week, the Bria rests. The Bria rests from its being mashpia in order to receive from above. And the zeicha for that is the Shabbos Ha'aretz, is the land resting. It's a totally different concept than the Shabbos Bereishis. The weekly Shabbos is the idea that it commemorates the historical fact of Bria Sa'olam, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu made the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th. So likewise, we emulate Rebbeinu Shalom. We also work for 6 days and rest on the 7th. Right? The Shabbos of Shemitah commemorates a different fact, the fact that the Bria rests once a week. That the entire universe, the spiritual forces that underlie the universe rest on Shabbos. They're not mashpia on Shabbos because they're receiving from above. And to commemorate that, once every 7 years we have a Shabbos Ha'aretz. The land has to rest. That's why it's halach in the land. Shabbos Bereishis, no such halach the land has to rest. We have to rest. Because since we're commemorating what HaKadosh Baruch Hu did, and as Jews we are meant to emulate the Rebbeinu Shalom, so we model our conduct after the Rebbeinu Shalom. He worked for 6 days and rested on the 7th. We work for 6 days and rest on the 7th. But Shemitah corresponds to the idea that the Bria rests. The universe rests on Shabbos. And therefore, in the same way that the universe rests on Shabbos, the land has to rest on Shabbos. And that's what the Shemitah is moisef on Shabbos Bereishis. And that's why it's halacha of Shemitah, specifically, of Shabbos Ha'aretz. The land has to rest. And therefore, even if a Gentile does the malacha, even though the Gentile is not obligated, he's not obligated to acknowledge the fact that it's Shabbos Ha'aretz, so he doesn't do anything wrong if he plows or plants. But L'maisa, the Jewish owner of the land, is mevatel the mitzvah saseh, because he has to see to it that there is a Shabbos Ha'aretz, that the land rests, and accordingly, if he doesn't, even if it's a Gentile who works the land, he's held liable. And of course, this is why in the Teichacha we find the idea that Golus is a consequence of Bittul Shemitah, because the land demands its Shabbos. So what is this idea the land demands Shabbos? We see it's clearly halakha in the land. It's not that a Jew has to keep Shemitah. If it was a Jew had to keep Shemitah, the land wouldn't have a claim. The land wouldn't expel the inhabitants to assert its claim to the Shemitah. But because it's halakha in Shabbos Ha'aretz, that the land has to rest, therefore the land asserts its claim and says that if you don't acknowledge this Shabbos Ha'aretz, then there'll be Golos, and the Shabbos Ha'aretz will be had in any case. That's why it's pashut, though, that the Shemitah is Kviya V'Kaima. Shemitah is exactly like Shabbos. It's two aspects of Shabbos. But both aspects have in common that the date is fixed. It's not dependent on the Kiddush of Bezdin, and therefore it's Kviya V'Kaima, it's fixed, and therefore there's nothing that we have to do to trigger the Shemitah, in the same way there's nothing we do to trigger the Shabbos. Yovel is a different thing entirely. What is the idea of Yovel? What are the halachas of Yovel? The halacha of Yovel is that Avodim go free, and the land is returned to its original owners. There's Avodim, let's say a Jew purchased an Eved Ivri, a Jewish slave. So the halacha is that if Yovel comes before the end of the Eved's term, the Eved goes free with Yovel. It's a time of liberty, so everyone goes free. The land, there was a chalukah there, so there was a division of the land, everyone was assigned a portion in the land. But over the course of the years, many people would sell their portions, and the original scheme of the chalukah, of the division, lapsed. So comes Yovel, everything is set straight. The original pattern of division is restored. The Zohar HaKadosh says that the idea of Yovel is going back to the original position. Going back to the way it was. As we tend to drift away from the ideal, and Yovel is a time of restoration. The ideal pattern is restored. And the truth is, the pasuk itself seems to say that. The pasuk says, "V'shavtim ishal l'chuzaso," each person returns to his inheritance. V'ishal mishpachtot teshuvu, each person returns to his family. In other words, the freedom of the Eved is not described as the Eved going free. Now he can do whatever he wants. He goes back to his family. And the land is not described as the land coming back to its owner. The person goes back to his land. The idea is that there is an ideal arrangement, and we drift away from it, and we have to go back to it. And that's what Yovel is. The Ramban says that the word Yovel, lehovil, means to transport something. Yuval Shai Lo, you bring a tribute to the king. So Yuval means to transport. Yovel is the time of transportation. It's the time that we are transported back in time to the way things were meant to be originally. And it's interesting, by the way, that one of the ad halachas of Yovel is that Yovel begins on Yom Kippur, not on Rosh Hashanah. It's not the Tekiyah Shofar of Rosh Hashanah that signals the beginning of Yovel. There's a special mitzvah of Tekiyah Shofar on Yom Kippur of Yovel, which triggers the release of the Avodim and the release of the Karkaos. And that makes perfect sense, because what is Yom Kippur? Yom Kippur also is a day of restoration. It's the day of Tshuva. Tshuva means return. We go back to the way we were meant to be all along. Elokim also as Adam Yashar, a person was created to be upright and straight. They sought many calculations, so we've corrupted our way. Yom Kippur, which is the day of Tshuva, we go back to the way we were meant to be. That's what Yovel is all about. Yovel is going back to the way things are meant to be. And that's the idea of the Avodim going free, going back to your family, and going back to your land. Because the idea is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, when he sends a person to this world, sends a person to the ideal matzav for him to realize his purpose, his function in life. Because if a person is born into a family, it's not b'mikra, it's not just by coincidence he's born into this family. He was sent to this family because this is the family, this type of support, this type of relationship, this is what he needs to become the type of person he needs to be to fulfill his purpose. Right? The resources of this world that are allotted to him are given to him because these are the kalim, these are the tools he needs to achieve his function. But we drift away. We drift away from our families. We drift away from our legacy, from our inheritance. We involve ourselves in other things. We trade it in for things that perhaps don't do us well. So every 50 years there's a Yovel. We return, we go back. We go back to our families, and we go back to our land. I just want to point out one interesting thing. This is just tangential. That the Gemara asks a question, Rashi brings, that pasuk of V'shaftim ishalach uzaso v'ishlo mishpachto tashubu, that pasuk which says that the Eved goes back to his family, really is redundant, because there's an earlier verse which says that Avadim go free. So Chazal are bothered, so why does the pasuk have to say it a second time? So the Gemara says that this second pasuk comes to be marba, that an Eved Ivri hanirtza, an Eved Ivri whose ear was pierced, who extended his term, also goes out b'yovel. So it just dawned on me that what is the significance of the fact that this pasuk talks about an Eved Nirtza specifically. So let's think about it. It's an amazing halacha. The halacha is that how does a person become a Nirtza? You have an Eved Ivri, he's meant to go free after 6 years, and he decides to stay. So the master pierces his ear, and he remains an Eved till Yovel. So why does that happen? How does it happen? He comes to the master and he says, Ohavti esishti, I love my wife and my master and my children, I don't want to go free. What wife is this a reference to? It means that as long as he's an Eved Ivri, the halacha is that the master can give him a shifcha knainis, a Gentile maidservant, with which he will have children. Now the halacha is that the Adain can only give a shifcha knainis if the Jew already is married. If he already has a regular wife, then the Adam can give an additional shivcha knainis. Otherwise, we learn from Sukkim that he can't. So let's figure out what's going on over here. This man has a family already. He's married, he has a Jewish wife, maybe he has children, and the master figures, well, he's a slave, I can get double duty out of him. So not only will he work by day, I'll give him a shivcha knainis at night, and he'll produce offspring, which will be slaves. And he does that. And this man, after 6 years, says, I like it. I like the shivcha knainis. I like my slave children. I like my master. I don't want to go free. What about his original family? In other words, we see there's an alienation, that he's been alienated from his original family to the extent that he wants to stay with his slave family. So about that situation, the pasuk says, "V'ishlo mishpachto tashubu." He returns to his real family. That's what Chazal say. That pasuk, "V'ishlo mishpachto tashubu," is speaking specifically about the Eved Nirtza. The Eved Nirtza, who was Nirtza, because he, in a sense, was ready to abandon his real family in order to stay with his slave family. The Torah says, "No, Ishlo mishpachto tashubu." In Yovel, he goes back to his real family. Says that's the family that was destined. That's the family where he was meant to be. That's the family where he's going to achieve his life's goals. And he has to go back. And that's what Yovel is all about. Sefer Hasidus explains that one of the aspects of going back, if we're talking about going back, and you want to go back all the way, where do we want to go back to? Go back to Gan Eden. Now, Gan Eden is an amazing thing. In Gan Eden, we were spared from the klala, from the curse of B'zeh asapecha techalechem. After the chet, there's a curse in all mankind that we eat by the sweat of our brow. Because we have to work hard, labor hard, in order to sustain ourselves. But in Gan Eden, that wasn't the case. In Gan Eden, everything grew on trees. The Midrashim tell us that the Eitz Hadas, according to one opinion, was chita, was wheat. And the question is that why would you call wheat a tree? It's not a tree at all. So the Mepharshim explained, because in Gan Eden, wheat did not grow kernels of wheat that had to be ground and baked. It grew bread, loaves of bread. And therefore it was like a tree. What's the difference between a tree and a grain? It was a tree, you pick the fruit and eat it, ready to eat. Grain, you have to harvest, mill, knead, bake, etc. So it's true that the Eitz Hadas was chita, but it was called a tree because the finished product grew out of it. Loaves of bread grew out of it. In Gan Eden, we didn't have the klala, we didn't have the curse of B'zeh asapecha techalechem. In this world, we have the curse. Now this curse has tremendous consequences. We've explained many times that it's not simply a punishment. that Adam did a chet, so Hashem made his life hard. It's really a different issue entirely. The curse of Bezeas HaPechukatai Chalechem is not so much a punishment for the chet, rather it's a consequence of the chet. Because before the chet, there was perfect clarity. Adam Rishon saw things as they truly were. After the chet, since he chose to be a Yodea Tevera, to exercise choice between good and evil, he had to be put in a situation where he could be fooled, where the truth and falsehood were both equally tempting. There's a great question that we all have to grapple with, that whose world are we living in? Are we living in the Ribono Shel Olam's world? Does he provide for us? Or are we on our own? Do we sustain ourselves? The consequence of the chet was that HaKadosh Baruch Hu created a scenario wherein a person could fool himself and delude himself into thinking that yes, I am the master of my own destiny, I sustain myself. If you work hard to keep body and soul together, you could walk away with the impression that I create wealth, I produce food, I am the master of my own existence. And that creates the great nisayon in life. As long as we were in Gan Eden, we all understood that we are eating from God's hand. When we leave Gan Eden, and we find ourselves in this world of Bezeas HaPechukatai Chalechem, where we eat bread by the sweat of our brow, we're not so sure anymore. We tend to forget. And we have to be warned, Hisham Alocha, be careful, Pantishkach Hashem Aleikacha, lest you forget the Ribono Shel Olam, because he'll say, that my strength enabled me to amass this wealth and create success. Yovel is a return to Gan Eden. That's the idea of min hasara tochlu es tevuasa. Right? That in Yovel avodas karka is aser. We eat from the field. We eat that which grows by itself from the field. We're eating from the hand of God. It's not the same idea as Shemitah. It's not the same idea as Shemitah. Shemitah, we can't work the land because there's the halacha, the land has to rest to commemorate Shabbos Bereshis, and so on and so forth. Yovel is going back to the way things are meant to be. It's a taste of Gan Eden. It's a taste of Olam Haba. It's the taste of the Olam HaTikun. In the same way that Avadim go back to their families, and land goes back to its owners, we go back to where we're meant to be. And that's what Yovel is all about. And that's why Yovel is not something which is Kriya the Kaima. Yovel is not something which is fixed by the Ribono Shel Olam. Yovel is something that can only be achieved through our understanding, only can be achieved through our effort. It's only when we send the Avadim free and when we send the land back that we understand that really this is not a world wherein we are free to live and do as we want. The Ribono Shel Olam owns the world. Kili ha'aretz, the world is his. Things have to be restored to their original position. And if we engage in that act of restoring things to the original position, we as well can have a taste of what will be when things are restored to the original position in Gan Eden. And therefore it's a totally different halacha. It's not kviya v'kaima. It's something which is very much dependent on us to understand and to put into practice and do, and therefore it's very different than Shemitah. And therefore as well, the special halacha of Shemitah, which is that the land has to rest, and therefore it's even aser for an akum, that doesn't apply to Yovel, as Chinuch says. So that's a halacha which only makes sense in relation to Shemitah. Such a halacha can't exist in Yovel, right? Shemitah, which is a commemoration of the fact that the Bria rests on Shabbos. So of course, there's a halacha the land has to rest, even if an Ovid Kechavim works the land. There'll be a neglect, a bittul of the mitzvah saseh. That has no halacha, has nothing to do with Yovel. That halacha can't exist in Yovel. Yovel has nothing to do with the land resting. Yovel has to do with us resting. It's us resting from the klal of Bezeas HaPechukatai Chalechem, going back to Gan Eden. And therefore, Avada, the Yisurim of Yovel, only apply to the Jew, don't apply to anybody else working the land. And therefore that difference between Shemitah and Yovel is exactly as we would expect. The Ramban writes in the beginning of the parsha that these two parashas, Behar and Bechukatai, were said at Har Sinai, and they comprise the bris that was made the second time around. That after Moshe broke the first luchas, Moshe davened that Klal would be forgiven, and the Kadosh Baruch Hu said, "Hinei Anochi Kairos Bris," I will establish a new covenant with Klal Yisrael. That new covenant is the covenant of Behar and Bechukatai. In other words, as we know, if you go back to Parshas Mishpatim, we read about the first covenant. So part of the covenant was the reading of the Sefer HaBris. There was a document, Rashi says it was the entire Chumash up until that point. That was the Sefer HaBris. Obviously, if you're making a covenant, you have to define the terms of the covenant. So they read the Sefer HaBris, and there was a ritual, and so on and so forth. The Ramban says, in that first version of the Sefer HaBris, there were no brachas and klolos. There were no incentives, no punishments, no rewards, because certainly if Klal Yisrael is in the Madrega, where they can become parties to the bris without threats and without incentives, it's even better. Right? Why should we demean the people by insisting that they have to have curses and punishments and threats? It says if people are altruistically willing to be makabel, then let them be makabel altruistically. And therefore, in the first version of the Sefer HaBris, there were no brachas and klolos. The Ramban says, in the second version of the Sefer HaBris, after they were diminished, as a consequence of the Chet HaEgel, at this point already there was a need for brachas and klolos, incentives, warnings, threats, and that's why the Sefer HaBris includes the Teichos of Parshas Bechukatai. But we know that the Sefer HaBris also includes mitzvahs. And the Sefer HaBris the first time around was comprised of the mitzvahs of Parshas Mishpatim, Parshas Yisro, Parshas Mishpatim. Those were the samples of mitzvahs which were the Sefer HaBris. In the same way that a ger, if a ger wants to convert, there's no halakha that a ger has to learn Kol HaTorah Kula before he converts. But he has to have a sampling, he has to have an idea of what being Jewish entails. So the Gemara says, Modi'in also mitzvahs kalas, mitzvahs chamor. So you give him a cross sample of mitzvahs, some easy mitzvahs, difficult mitzvahs. So he has an idea what it means to be a Jew. So the Sefer HaBris as well. This is like a conversion of the entire nation. It's a covenant. So you have to have a sampling of mitzvahs. So the sampling of mitzvahs were the mitzvahs the first time around in Parshas Mishpatim. The sampling of mitzvahs the second time around are the mitzvahs of Parshas Behar. That's what Ramban says. The Sefer HaBris of the second covenant, the covenant after the Chet HaEgel, are the mitzvahs of Parshas Behar. And that really is what Behar Bechukatai is. It's the Sefer HaBris. It includes brachas and klolos, that's Parshas Bechukatai, and the sampling of mitzvahs, which define the terms of the Sefer HaBris, are the mitzvahs in Parshas Behar Bechukatai, and most noteworthy are the mitzvahs of Shemitah and Yovel. And the question is, of all the mitzvahs, there's a lot of mitzvahs, Taryag mitzvahs, why are the mitzvahs of Shemitah and Yovel so central to the concept of the Sefer HaBris? Well, it's Pashut. Because Shemitah really is where we came from, and Yovel is where we're going to. Whereas Shemitah commemorates the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu made the world, and He's actively engaged in the world, and that, of course, is central. In other words, the idea of a bris, making a covenant with the Ribono Shel Olam, of course, is built on the understanding that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was engaged with the world, engaged with us. And that's what Shemitah is meramis to. But it also necessitates an understanding of what our objectives are, what our goals are. That there's an overall scheme, there's a plan. And as far as we drift away from that plan, we are always determined to find our way back and to correct ourselves and to achieve the ultimate objective. That's what Yovel is all about. Returning the Avodim returning to their families, and the fields returning to their owners, and our returning to Gan Eden, where it's Mina Aretz Tochlu is Tvuasa, when we eat from God's hand, and we don't delude ourselves that we are the masters of our own success. So that's the Sefer HaBris. Those are the mitzvahs which Ribono Shel Olam establish the covenant with the second time around, to understand that there is a God who is engaged with the world, and understand that He has a scheme, a plan that we have to strive to achieve in our lives. And that brings us to the conclusion of Sefer Vayikra, with the chasima, with the sealing of the covenant. This, of course, is the covenant that is eternal, that lasts ad yom hazeh, until this very day, unlike that of the first Sefer Bris, which was allowed to lapse with the Chet Egel. This is the covenant which remains in force ad yom hazeh.